Rewriting past wrongs, I have no mouth and I must scream. Harlan Ellison is best described as one of my problematic faves. My first experience of his work was through the short story I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and the video game of the same title. Having discovered this work of science fiction through seeing the name on a list of games for an old PC games emulator, I played the game first and read the book second. Whereas I found the game a fascinating look at the cruelty and evil of humanity, one that ultimately concludes in loving humanity for its potential to do good and be better, I found the book to be incredibly pessimistic, reveling in bigotry and upholding that hatred as proper and good. Am's changes to the people he tortures are meant to be seen as Am revealing the true inner natures of people that they once hid from society. However, even though I disagree with the core belief, as a work of literature I can look past the Hobbesian view of human nature and the use of the biblical illusion of I am that I am, presenting the supercomputer Am as both a placeholder for God and Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Though I also think that Ellison misunderstands and misrepresents René Descartes in the stories when he quotes the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." It is the specifics of the commentary on humanity that will not sit right with me. The two characters in question, Benny and Ellen, represent the bulk of the use of racism as a motif in the book, keeping in mind that this book is American literature and was released in 1967, just a few years after the passing of the Civil Rights Act. It exists in a time where Jim Crow laws have just barely started being removed from state law, and black people were routinely still portrayed as the black-faced minstrel caricature or as literal apes and monkeys. Without keeping the history and the context in mind, many modern readers of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream are primed to read it literally as science fiction world building, while missing subtle aspects of the social commentary. Thus, the depiction of Benny, to me, as a black man, does not read simply as a person transformed into an ape by the supercomputer Am. Benny is a homosexual man, transformed by Am into a black man with a massive penis with an uncontrollable desire to sexually assault women. The use of ape-like imagery to describe Benny is not literal. It is a metaphorical use of the exact same imagery used to depict black men in its time being used in its own time. I understand why this would make you uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. Yet it is also the reality of how white American authors used black men in fiction and art. To explain the dynamics of this narrative choice, let me give you a crash course of American sociology. Lesson 1. Race is gendered and gender is racialized. This means that men and women of different races experience both racism and sexism differently and distinctly because racism and sexism inform each other when developing bigoted stereotypes. For example, racist depictions of Asian people follow a core practice of hyperfeminization of Asian men and women. Asian men are depicted as having small penises, as being physically weak, and as sneaky and emotionally manipulative, rather than facing problems directly. Racism against Asian men is hyperfeminized. Asian women are depicted as hyperfeminized as well. The China doll stereotype portrays Asian women as sexually available and submissive. The dragon lady stereotype portrays Asian women as fiercely dedicated to domestic life and obedient to their husbands. Because of this, American men often fetishize Asian women as the sex object, trophy wife, and girl you can bring home to mom, all in one package. These are stereotypes that apply exclusively to Asian women. Sexism against Asian women is racialized. I highlight the hyper-feminization of racism against Asians to juxtapose that racism against African people is just the opposite. Racist depictions of black men are hyper-masculinized. Our bodies are presented as primitive and supernaturally stronger than white people. People perpetuate biological lies that black men have giant penises and unique springs in our muscles that made us physically stronger. Yet through inherently racist eugenics perspectives on evolution, the pseudoscience of phrenology asserted that our skulls were ape-like, and thus we lacked the capacity to think rationally. We were presented as having an uncontrollable desire to rape white women, and such racist beliefs, for a time, had even been supported in the common law of United States courts and jurisprudence. There is an abundance of cases where the only evidence of the allegation of rape was that the plaintiff was a white woman and the defendant was black, as well as an abundance of cases where the plaintiff is the estate of a murdered black man and the defendant is a white police officer who, armed with a gun against an unarmed plaintiff, was upheld as fearing for his life simply because the plaintiff had a black man's body. More modern cases hide those specific details of the dynamic from the arguments presented in court, but you can find them stated explicitly in court stenographer records for cases around and before the passing of the Civil Rights Act. These hyper-masculinized, racist depictions of black men are exactly how Benny is represented in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, as an ape with a massive penis and an uncontrollable desire to rape women. This is not a coincidence. It is the reiteration of a common trope. The only dynamic of nuance in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is that it is a gay man being punished for being a sexual deviant. The only sexual deviancy being described was that he was gay. By being transformed into a black person, the punishment was being transformed into a black person, which itself becomes a trope in the coming years. For example, the almost released DC comic superhero The Black Bomber, who was a white supremacist whose superpower was to transform into a black person. Or the Punisher comic, issues 59 to 62, in which a plastic surgeon transforms the Punisher into a black person to hide his identity. He learns a lesson about social injustice and police brutality, then promptly forgets that lesson and goes back to being a pro-police white vigilante in the following issues. Never forget that the Punisher is satire. You are not meant to idolize the Punisher. In the book version of No Mouth Must Scream, Ellen is explicitly revealed to be a black woman. The sexist stereotypes that specifically target black women are also hyper-masculinized. Black women are depicted often as violent, boisterous, and mean, but also as sexually promiscuous. Continuing the racist depiction of black people as apes, black women are presented as hypersexual, constantly wanting to have sex with whoever is available, rather than in the feminized version of obediently responding to a man's desire to have sex. Black women are slut-shamed by a stereotype of innately wanting to have indiscriminate sex, like a man. Unlike the China doll stereotype against Asian women, this tribalistic depiction of black women's sexuality presents black women as sexual objects, but not suitable for love nor marriage. Ellen's role in the book as a woman who is both protected by and assaulted by the men around her reveals the dynamics of racism being presented in this story through its depiction of the relationship between Benny and Ellen. Ellen is depicted as only enjoying sex with Benny because of his giant ape-like penis. If you read Benny's character as the racist depiction of black men as monkeys in that time, then you must also read Ellen as explicitly a black woman in the story as being presented with the same hypermasculinity and tribalism stereotypes that harm black women in society. If instead you read Benny's character literally as a man transformed into an ape, then you must concede that Ellen is being depicted with this racist depiction of being an ape-like, hyper-masculinized slut for wanting to engage in bestiality with an ape. The sexism and the racism written into this short story are inherently intertwined and inescapable. And, strangely enough, I still like this story. It is well written, a fascinating depiction of human nature in an unimaginably desperate situation, in which we see the people striving meaninglessly against Am to retain their humanity and ultimately failing to do so. A dark, comedic tragedy like no other in its own time. Which brings me to the 1995 graphic adventure game I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, a game that was also written by Harlan Ellison along with David Sears and David Mullick. A game that I also really enjoy, a game that elevates the narrative the original short story presented and through gameplay has alleviated the bigotry that the short story relied on. In the video game of No Mouth Must Scream, Am can be defeated. Each character in the story becomes a playable character in the game. Rather than traveling together on an epic quest to obtain some canned food, Am places each character in a simulated reality designed to torture them, forcing the characters to relive their traumas and attempting to make the characters fall to their baser instincts. As a graphic adventure, the player must solve the puzzles of each level to progress, but each puzzle is narratively intertwined with acting on the world. Each puzzle has multiple solutions, a solution that allows the character to repeat their past moral failings, and a solution that allows the character to begin overcoming their trauma and growing as a person. In depicting the character of Benny, by literally visually depicting him as a man deformed, not making any depiction or reference to the size of his penis, whose only goal is to find some food soft enough to eat, Benny is distanced from the hateful and racist depiction of black people. The setting of his story, however, being placed in a generic tribal village, feels like the aesthetic has not been fully diverted. The whispers of inherent racism still linger. In depicting Ellen's character, her rebellious and confrontational dialogue is cast with an assertive and confident expertise. Both are treated as positive traits because she is the only character confident enough to directly oppose Am verbally. Her ability to fight Am with her words, to crack jokes in the middle of mental torture, juxtaposes her dialogue starkly from the male characters who mostly curse and lament their own circumstances. Ellen is no longer presented as a sexual object relative to the other characters, and no longer presented as desiring to relive her trauma. With these changes, the story and its characters are changed drastically, and in such a way that I may engage with the video game without having to remember the reality of the past. Yet I do not know if I can say that the game truly addresses or makes up for the implications contained within the original short story. In Benny's section, he must converse with gravestones that represent the people he used to know and his moral failings. His lack of compassion for the struggles of others culminated in Benny murdering his fellow soldiers for not living by his standards. The last soldier that is revealed by the gravestones is Brickman. Brickman says to Benny, You might have changed in the present, Commander, but you still have crimes in the past to account for. You have to bury the past, Commander. The past does not go away simply by getting further from it. It stays with you. Perhaps recreating I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream as a video game in 1995 was Ellison's attempt to bury the past. Stay true.